Hello, Pittsburgh. I'm Zach Gibson, and this is Triblive's From the Newsroom podcast, bringing you top stories from Triblive.com. A growing sense of fear and uncertainty is gripping international students at Carnegie Mellon University and across the United States as visa revocations become increasingly common under the Trump administration's heightened federal scrutiny. Some students who have not violated any immigration rules are choosing to stay in the country rather than risk being denied reentry. The anxiety was intensified when Jayson Ma, a Carnegie Mellon student, publicly revealed that his student visa was terminated just one semester before graduation, despite having completed a court-ordered rehabilitative program for a past DUI. Now, myself and Triblive reporter Megan Swift went to CMU to see how these students were sitting with the current events. Good morning, Megan.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on. So, for those who aren't familiar, I'm going to have you give a brief overview of the current situation.
For sure. So both of us went to Carnegie Mellon's campus on Thursday following the news of Jayson Ma and how he went public with his visa revocation. And we noticed, right off the bat, the mood was heightened and tense. This was just a day after Jayson had come forward about that news. And similar stories have been playing out across the country with international students being targeted by the Trump administration, including several colleges in Pennsylvania, not just Carnegie Mellon. So the University of Pittsburgh, Penn State, and the University of Pennsylvania have been impacted as well. Immigration attorneys have said the students being targeted have had a run-in with the law, with some as minor as traffic infractions, and in other cases, the criminal charges were withdrawn or dismissed. So that sort of had checked out with the situation of Jayson Ma and his DUI. And as soon as we got on campus, we started trying to ask students about what the climate was, just ask their thoughts on the situation. And we were met with hesitancy, which is pretty common when you're reporting political articles. But this specifically, people were scared. You have any sort of ties to this situation, you're scared to speak out in this case because this is happening across the country numerous times. And so that was the climate that we were met with on campus when we started walking around.
Okay. Now, when we went out to Carnegie Mellon University, it was after the initial story that had been put out about Jayson. And something that we both noticed on our end was the reaction from the social presence from our sites. Something I particularly noticed, it was extremely spirited, I'll say. A lot of people had opinions, a fair amount on either side, supporting or dissenting from this latest practice from the Trump administration. In seeing how engaged the community was, we decided it was important to go and follow up on and see what other angles could we shed lights on in this story. So let's talk a little bit about the reporting process when heading into a situation like this, specifically when it comes to a college campus. Are there different things to try and keep in mind when going to interview subjects?
For sure. I think first and foremost is being as empathetic as possible and trying to put yourself in their shoes as reporters and just understanding it's totally valid to not want to speak out on the record about the situation. But even just talking to people who are expressing those fears to us and maybe aren't agreeing to go on the record, I think that gave us more insight into the situation and into the story that needed to be written, despite them not agreeing to actually do the interviews.
Okay. For our listeners who aren't familiar with reporting, talk me through our day at Carnegie Mellon.
Yeah, so our game plan was more so to try and hit some of the common spaces on CMU's campus, like any sort of student hub areas that we could find. So we started off by checking out the visitor center, and then we checked out some of the bigger buildings, and then we found what was the main campus hub where there was the student bookstore and a lot of students who were tabling. So that ended up being really helpful. We spoke to some people who were already talking about their political opinions with students. So we reasoned that those people would be more likely to speak out to the media about the situation, and we were definitely correct.
Okay. Now, you said this at the top of the episode, but I want to come back to it just for a little bit, just to start to color what readers will see when reading this story. Initially, when trying to interview some subjects, we got met with a little bit of hesitancy and fear, I'll say, based on the potential for negative blowback as a result of speaking either way on this situation. Can you tell me a little bit about that experience?
So aside from just like being denied interviews overall, I did actually complete an interview with one individual, and at the end of the interview, when I asked him to confirm the spelling of his first and last name and tell us his age, major, and concentration at Carnegie Mellon, he then refused to go on the record at all because he didn't want his name included. He asked if he could just have his first name, which we can't really do in this situation, and then asked for it not to be included at all, which was not possible for this article specifically. So, yeah, we weren't able to use that interview.
Okay. Now, is this something you commonly see on your everyday story, or do you think you've experienced it more with this specific topic?
It was something I saw a lot during election reporting when I was out in the field in October and November, specifically related to expressing political opinions and affiliations. And I think it was very similar to that situation in terms of not wanting to express political opinions, but also with the added aspect of safety concerns. So this was a little bit different, and I think we are seeing it more recently, and we'll talk about it in a little bit, but that was sort of the catalyst to the hearing that I covered at the federal courthouse yesterday.
What I'm hearing is, in the space of reporting on politics and policy, it seems like although the policies that are playing out in Washington now seem to be a lot more brash and loud or more covered in media, the conversation about it, while it feels very charged and heightened in person when it's time to go on the record, there is a lot of fear, hesitancy, or restraint, which is something that feels relatively new. I'm not going to say it's not something that hasn't been throughout journalism's past, but in the last 5 years, it seems to be much more of a stark turn towards not wanting to go on the record to fully say an opinion on a specific policy, action, legislation, what have you.
Mm-hmm.
So, moving on a little bit from that, let's talk about the students at CMU. Were there any interviews that stuck out to you?
Yeah, for sure. We spoke with Scanned Vijay, who is 25 years old and came to America last year to pursue a master's degree in information systems management at Carnegie Mellon. He came over from India, and he hasn't been back to his home country since August. He's expecting to graduate in this December, but he, after speaking with his family and just deciding on his own, he said he won't attempt to go back home to visit India until after he graduates Carnegie Mellon because he's too nervous about the possibility of not being allowed back into the United States in order to finish up that education. Though he hasn't done anything to jeopardize his visa as an international student in general, and seeing other international students having their visas revoked, he just doesn't want to take any chances, he said. He said, quote, "I am scared that if I go back and I'm not allowed to come back to the U.S., my degree and education will be compromised."
Okay. In that interview, Scand told us that he heard of this situation that he fears of, which helped him make this decision to stay in the United States, has happened to others before, where others have visited home and not been allowed back for various different reasons. You also asked about advice that he had for other international students. What did he have to say there?
Yeah, he said, the first priority should be making sure that all of your paperwork is up to date and complete. He said that was a main priority of his whenever he was trying to come over to the US. But he said, he hadn't experienced any issues with his visa to this point, and the process of undergoing his background checks was, quote, pretty smooth through Carnegie Mellon. But that doesn't take away from the anxious nature of the situation for international students, for sure.
Absolutely. Even just coloring that experience a little bit more, as I was your photographer for this story, I saw and experienced the hesitancy from all of the students when going up to ask. There was a lot of shifting eyes, there was a lot of fingers fidgeting and uncertainty when it came to even just the decision to respond, whether or not to actually partake in the interview. But to your point, it is clearly something that you could visually see. Even through some of these photos, there's a look of uncertainty on your subjects' faces. Now, Skand is an international student, and you also interviewed a few students that were native to the US. Can you tell me a little bit about Lillian Zhao and her concerns and feelings on the entire situation? Lillian, we had met at a very interesting and very opportune point while interviewing these students.
For sure. So Lillian spoke to us. We met her at a tabling event that she was holding for her club, Project 26, which encourages students to register to vote and participate in local elections. And she said that she had seen the email about the visa revocations from Carnegie Mellon while she was in class on Monday. Though she was shocked as a U.S. citizen, she said she doesn't have as much to worry about. She said, quote, they have a lot more to risk when speaking publicly about politics, protesting, so they don't have the same privileges as citizens. Zhao, 23, she grew up in the Pittsburgh area after her parents came over from China, and she's currently a senior at Carnegie Mellon studying business and statistics. She said, when her mother came over from China to study at Carnegie Mellon, she didn't have to worry about her visa getting revoked back then. Lillian told us it's, quote, a lot more dangerous for international students now.
Okay. Now, in her interview, she also said she feels lucky to be born here and that she thinks it's a good country to live in, comparing the United States day to day to her experiences in China. She characterized it as much worse, and she said that many people don't realize how lucky they are to be here. I think Lillian has a very interesting perspective. She has a family with the experience of both being native born in the United States and immigrating to the United States when looking at this topic. And I think that is part of the reason we see so many different sides through her answers. While she recognized that she didn't have as much to worry about, she did sympathize with the situation for many of the students who do have to worry about having their visas revoked. In general, when addressing the students of Carnegie Mellon, she said that these students are smart people who have a lot to contribute to the workforce. She said they're studying. They shouldn't have to worry about having their visas being revoked, especially for a reason like free speech. Now, Megan, we also spoke with Andrew Timmons, a 30-year-old PhD student from Austin, Texas. We found him tabling and helping students register to vote. Can you tell me about your conversation with him?
Andrew, said he was concerned to hear about this conversation with the visas being revoked. He said it's a really scary situation. He said, quote, these students are just going to school. The possibility of losing the ability to do that or having serious repercussions, that is terrifying. Like you said, he's 30 years old from Austin, Texas, and he's pursuing a PhD in material science at Carnegie Mellon. And he is also a representative in Carnegie Mellon's Graduate Student Assembly. So he said he's been trying to find ways to support international students, and he was there tabling to support local politics and get people registered to vote. He said that it's just unbelievably cruel to essentially put students in a position where they come to a country to pursue an education and are now being put in a position of being told, quote, you said something we don't like and you are going to face repercussions because of that, to the extent of being deported. That is insane, he said. So he basically said he believes many people didn't realize that these visa threats could be carried out so close to home until now, seeing that their fellow Carnegie Mellon students are being affected.
Close to home was a good choice of words because that was exactly where I was heading next. We went to CMU after Jayson Ma decided to tell us about his story, but you recently just covered another side of this story where students are afraid of losing their privileges of being able to study here in the United States.
Yeah, I was at the federal courthouse downtown yesterday for most of the day covering a hearing that was centered on two international Carnegie Mellon graduate students whose ability to study in the US was terminated under this crackdown by the Trump administration. Their student status was revoked in the Federal Student and Exchange Visitor Information System, also known as SEVIS, which the U.S. Department of Homeland Security uses to monitor and track information on international scholars. So they testified Tuesday in federal court seeking to restore their education status and complete their degrees at Carnegie Mellon. Since their SEVIS status has been revoked, they're no longer allowed to attend class, and they've been paying for class this spring. So that was one of the concerns that was brought up during their testimonies in the federal courthouse Tuesday. So what was really interesting about this case was the student's lawyer, Adrian Rowe, initially showed up in the courthouse without his clients because he was fearful they might be deported in the process of, revealing themselves to the court and talking about the situation. The men were identified only by pseudonym initials in the lawsuit that was filed last week against Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem and the acting head of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE. So in the complaint, which was filed on Monday, Rowe requested the reinstatement of his client's records in the federal tracking system, which would return them to a lawful status, which is necessary for them to continue their studies. So essentially during the hearing, they were seeking to get a temporary restraining order to force the government to make that change and reinstate their status. But lawyers for the U.S. government argued that they could not defend that case without knowing who the plaintiffs are. U.S. District Judge William S. Stickman also requested that the plaintiffs identify themselves before the court. And Rose said that both students were waiting in his downtown Pittsburgh office on the Boulevard of the Allies, which is roughly 10 blocks away, and he could bring them to the courthouse within 10 minutes to testify, but he wanted the guarantee that they wouldn't be detained by U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement officials on the way to the federal courthouse on Grant Street. He was worried for their safety. So Judge Stickman said he would make sure the students received, quote, safe harbor between Rowe's office and the courthouse so they could testify. He forbade ICE officials from arresting the plaintiffs as they walked to the courthouse, and then he later issued an order barring Homeland Security and ICE from beginning deportation proceedings. The judge said, quote, the plaintiffs in this case are to be brought to court without obstruction. I'm not going to let anybody get taken out of my courtroom. You can rest assured on that.
Okay. Going back to some of the responses from social media, a common theme from many commenters was a sentiment really pulling from the fact that a lot of these visas were revoked for some type of legal infraction. There were international students who became targets of the Trump administration for attending pro-Palestinian rallies on other campuses, and specifically in Jayson Ma's case, he said he made sure to steer clear of those types of things for this reason. As you said at the top of the episode, the students have had run-ins with the law in some different ways, minor traffic infractions, criminal charges that were withdrawn or dismissed, like the expunged DUI in Jayson Ma's case. In the comments, a very common theme that I saw was intolerance for illegal activity. Lots of comments along the lines of the visa itself is a privilege and breaking the law is grounds to lose that privilege. Comments on the other side, a lot of discussion about the intricacies and the potential for misuse or overreach. But what became more interesting to me now is the recent development with Trump after meeting with the El Salvadorian president. saying that he is now seeking to move toward deporting what he calls homegrowns, native-born American citizens who have had infractions with the law. So, what are your feelings when hearing the sentiment of intolerance for illegal activity and the potential for the current practice now overreaching from non-citizens to people with birthright citizenship?
I think it puts a lot of pressure on anyone who is internationally born at all. You know, maybe they didn't come over on their student visas or whatever. There are many different ways that people can come to the United States and become citizens here and have temporary visas, et cetera, et cetera. I think what is important to note is what has happened after these infractions have taken place. For example, I want to talk about expungement of the record. Something that, you know, I was very familiar with in college, actually, when I was at the Daily Collegian at Penn State. You know, if someone has their record expunged of an infraction, they then have the authority to request that their coverage of the criminal proceedings of their case be taken down from the Collegian website. And that's something that has stuck with me over the years. You know, obviously, I work full time at the Trib now. It's been almost 2 years. But yes, there have been some infractions like DUIs or these traffic citations, etc. But more often than not, you see that their records have been completely expunged, which in the United States, if your record has been expunged, if you're just a natural born U.S. citizen, that takes away all burden of guilt from you because you're able to be back in society and operate as your average citizen would. And you're able to, therefore request that your coverage in the media be taken down. So I think that's where my mind goes when I hear about these situations, because it's like, yes, people have had pasts, but if those infractions were minor enough to be expunged by court order, I think that says something.
Absolutely. Now, where my mind goes after hearing all that is when Trump uses the phrase homegrown in talking about even repealing birthright citizenship, where is the line, if that makes sense? It seems like, and I'm sure we will find out in the coming months of the Trump presidency, what his actual intentions are when it comes to how far he plans to push this initiative. And if these types of things that many Americans aren't worried about will start to become things that come to the forefront of the Americans' minds.
I think people are already worried about it. I think that's safe to say. I mean, even just talking with some of the people when we were at CMU and they're U.S. citizens, it's like people are still hesitant to talk about the topic because they just don't want their name anywhere near any of this.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So obviously, hesitancy for fear of reciprocal blowback or consequences has been a very large theme for this discussion. Now, in the case that you just recently covered, thankfully, there were protections that help these individuals feel more comfortable about sharing their experience.
Yeah. So after the judge agreed to provide that protection for the plaintiffs to make it to the courthouse to testify, the lawyer Adrian Rowe was able to reveal their identities, and they are Aryaman Shandilia and Pratik Adhikari, both Carnegie Mellon graduate students. So they were identified before the court, and just as we were talking about, both of them had minor brushes with the law previously. The lawsuit, however, that Rowe had filed said the interactions with law enforcement did not amount to anything serious enough to warrant termination of their student status. So that's what Rowe was arguing before the court.
Okay.
And in the cases of his clients, one case was expunged and the other was dismissed. So as we just talked about, like the expungement. Shandilia was born in New Delhi, India, and he came to the U.S. in August with an F1 visa to study for his master's degree in artificial intelligence engineering. So he found out that his student status, that SEVIS status, was terminated on April 3rd, and then his visa, F1 visa, was then revoked on April 8th. So that was a 5-day turnaround.
Wow.
He said before the court both plaintiffs said that this court appearance was the first time stepping out of their house since finding out that their SEVIS status had been revoked. They had not left their house, not to go to the grocery store, not to get gas, not to get anything else they might need. You know, they're just leaving their house to go to court at the request of their lawyer. So during the Tuesday hearing, Shandelia recounted when he had been taken to jail following an incident during the early hours of November 16th in Southside Flats. He had, quote, a few drinks and was detained by a police officer for public intoxication and disorderly behavior. After his hearing on December 5th, his charges were dropped and then his record was expunged. And he talked about how since his SEVIS status and F1 visa have been revoked, he hasn't been able to attend class, which we discussed already. If you don't have a SEVIS status that is all checked out, then teachers are no longer allowed to teach you in person. So he testified that he also has a 4-credit internship set up for the summer, but he won't be able to participate in that internship if he doesn't have his SEVIS status reinstated, essentially. And that would harm his job prospects. He only needs 3 more courses before his planned graduation after the fall 2025 term, but he might not get to walk across the stage to receive his diploma if the court doesn't order for his SEVIS status to be reinstated. He said, quote, it's unclear if I will ever be able to complete my degree at CMU. When the government lawyers were cross-examining the testimony, they were asking both Shandelia and Adhikari about if they would be able to attend classes in their home country or go to a different university aside from CMU that would not be in the United States that would offer the same degree or the same opportunities. And both said that they would not be able to do that. For example, Shandelia said he decided to only apply to Carnegie Mellon for his master's program because it's the best school for artificial intelligence, which is what he wants to do in relation to engineering. He said, quote, my first priority has always been CMU. And then for Adhikari, the United States has been his home since August 2017 when he left Nepal to get his bachelor's degree at the University of Mississippi. He then graduated his undergrad in 2021. And he is approaching the end of his first year in the Master's of Business Administration program at CMU's Tepper School of Business. His brush with law enforcement came in 2019 while driving in Tennessee. He was pulled over for a traffic violation as he merged onto a highway. Essentially, a police officer had already been on the shoulder of the road, and in some states, you have to get over into the left lane to leave a lane open between the incident on the side of the road and the people driving. He did not do that in time because he was merging, and so he got this traffic violation. So then he had to pay court fees of $71.07, and his case ended up being dismissed. But then he found out about his SEVIS status termination on April 8th. And he hasn't left his apartment either. He's already paid for classes in full for the spring. And just like Shandelia, he has a 4-credit internship set up for the summer.
So both of these students, for very minor reasons, it seems, have the end or the next step in their educational and potential professional careers upended as a result of this new charge that's coming from the administration to a lot of international students.
Yeah, and unlike Shandelia, whose F1 visa had officially been revoked, Adhikari hasn't received any communication as to whether his visa has been revoked. So a big conversation during this hearing yesterday was, it is unknown the connection between SEVIS status and F1 visa. But the lawyer Rowe was arguing that if your SEVIS status is revoked, then the government cannot give you a visa. So that's why, like in the case of Shandelia, the visa had been revoked 5 days after the SEVIS status was revoked.
Okay.
But there was just a lot of, confusion during that hearing. So that's why, because of that sparring over who has the jurisdiction over the student status, they decided to approve the request in part and deny the request in part. That was the resolution yesterday. So basically, one of the government lawyers, Adam Fisher, said the Department of Homeland Security and ICE are the entities who maintain the SEVIS system. But the State Department is responsible for issuing and revoking visas. So it's two different, procedural processes here. And Fisher was saying that the courts don't have any say in requesting that the government reinstate this because it is up to the State Department, at least for the visa. And then it's up to the Homeland Security and ICE to reinstate SEVIS. So Fisher then suggested the students reach out to Carnegie Mellon officials regarding their status and try to appeal to an immigration judge. But Rowe is maintaining that the students' statuses were terminated arbitrarily without notice and without due process. And the due process are the key words here in this case, because he wants the students to be able to advocate for themselves in this situation, how they were not given notice of the termination and how it is going to affect their lives undeniably. So Stickman, the judge, did not end up ruling on his request for restoring the status in the government system. The judge said, quote, there could be arbitrariness or capriciousness in relation to the change of status, but that has not been proven yet in court. So he scheduled another hearing on April 25th on the request for the preliminary injunction. So it was partially denied and it was partially approved because both students have a guarantee that they will not be arrested, detained, or deported in that time while these court proceedings are still going on. So they are safe at least until the end of the month.
Okay. But there really is no for certain way to know which way this court proceedings will go for these students.
Correct.
Okay, as I said, this is a very broad and complicated topic, but Megan, I want to thank you for your work on these series of stories and for coming on today to help try and explain this situation that is facing many here in America today.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining. If you enjoyed this week's episode, share the podcast to help keep Western PA locally informed with insightful discussion and the latest news from your area. It's an easy way to spread the word, and it helps our podcast reach more people like you. Don't forget to follow us on Spotify and turn on episode notifications so you never miss new content. Once again, I'm Zach Gibson, and this is From the Newsroom.